Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated property buyer. And I'm joined, as always, by Dave Johnston and Cate Bakos. Hello, guys.
Hello.
Good morning.
This episode, we're going to be talking about the delicate dance of trying to buy something and sell something as part of a similar sort of transaction. So obviously when people are upgrading and downgrading, there can be the situation where you need to sell to buy, or you're wondering, should you sell before you buy? There's bridging considerations. There's considerations for how it works in a buyer's versus a seller's market. So a lot to unpack at the moment. I would say that we are in an upgraders market, and the way that I would sort of explain it is, if you are, say, buying, you're selling, let's say, $1 million place, and you've got a 10% haircut. So, you're losing 100K. But if you're then buying a $2 million place with a 10% haircut, you're saving 200K. So there's a 100K differential. And that's just one consideration for people when they're swapping. And obviously we can have the inverse. And Cate, at the moment, we're actually probably seeing more of a haircut on the top end than we are at the bottom as well. So that comes into play as well.
Yeah, in a lot of our markets, particularly our capital city markets right now, that is exactly the case. So the higher quartile priced properties are definitely the ones that are struggling and exhibiting the stronger price falls. So for some people who might be doing a significant upgrade, if they're selling at the same time as they're buying, provided that they've got a saleable asset and what they're looking for is easy to purchase, and I'll go into that in detail later, they might find that it's a really advantageous move. So it's not an uncommon question. And you'll hear a lot of professionals talking about a buyer's market being an upgraders market.
And I've actually just got a little bit of the data here in front of me on the quartiles, where Sydney has fallen by 4.6% in the top quartile, whereas the bottom quartile has only fallen by 0.7%. And that's the starkest differential. But Melbourne's 4%, top quartile has fallen by. Bottom quartile only 0.3%. ACT, top quartile has fallen by 2%. Whereas the bottom quartile is a bit larger falls than Melbourne and Sydney, 1.1%. But yeah, look, it's certainly it's actually in all the capital cities except for Darwin. Interestingly enough, the top quartile is performing the weakest by a significant margin in pretty much all of them.
Yeah, Darwin, as we've explained a few times, is a little bit of an unusual case study in and of itself. So we know that we're in a buyer's market, so buyers have more power than sellers do. So I would say that it's a lot less risky to buy something than it is to sell something. So it begs the question in this market, Cate, what happens first? Do we buy? Do we sell?
Okay, so we've chatted about the market conditions and the opportunity for an advantageous purchase, but what we haven't chatted about is some of the differences that can really throw that theory. And if you've got a property that you're looking for that is a needle in a haystack, so it's very, very rare, or you've looked at the frequency of sales for such a product and it might be 1 or 2 a year. Well, if you go and sell first and then you're waiting to buy, you could be waiting for a long time. The market could change. It could start to improve. You might have a hard time finding somewhere to rent for that kind of period. It might be an area where rents are really expensive. So you've got to weigh up, firstly, what is the product that I'm looking for? How scarce is it? And what sort of frequency are we seeing these types of properties sell within? Because if it's a long time running, you're looking into potentially a very different market. And then the other consideration that I always talk about is how difficult is your current property to sell? And what sort of challenges could you have? Because I was chatting to someone semi-recently and they had a property that was on company share title. So it's not restricted to Melbourne, but it's a very Melbourne-esque type of title. We've talked about it heaps on the show. They can be very, very hard to sell, particularly when you're in a market that's catering to first home buyers. So they had a beautiful property in Elwood, but it was company share. And to get that property sold easily for a price that they're okay with, you've got to find the right buyer. Investors have always been able to deal with company share a little more readily than first home buyers because they have more equity than a typical first home buyer will have in savings. A company share property, you might need a 40% deposit depending on your lender and their policy, certainly 20% at the absolute minimum. So asking yourself, how rare is the property that I'm looking to purchase and how tough is my current property to sell is a really essential question. Because if you go and buy something that you love and then you turn to sell your property and you're in a difficult market like the one that we're in now and you can't find a purchaser quickly enough, you might find that settlement's approaching and all of a sudden you haven't got your settlement funds to settle your purchase. And that's a nightmare situation.
And thankfully, Dave, when we are, let's say, upgrading, we don't have to put our property on the market, wait for it to exchange, and then settle, and then go shopping. We can use bridging finance. But any good engineer would say, well, bridges are doing their job when the span is a particular length and a particular structure is supporting it. But the real risk is how long does that bridge need to be? So when is bridging finance appropriate and when can it become risky? Because I'm guessing that these financiers don't just let you bridge for as long as you like.
Yeah, no, that's right, Mike. Some good analogies there. The reality is most people don't bridge, so they do need to think through what is the right timing, which property to sell, to whether they sell first or do they buy first. What are the risks? Because there are risks associated with doing either first or second. So it can be a scary time in some ways for people because, as Cate said, often when you're upgrading, the home that you're going to be satisfied with is pretty rare. So there's no guarantees you're going to find something in a short period of time after you sell, and you don't want to be having to rent and move all your belongings twice, but uproot your home and your lifestyle, particularly if you have a young family. It's hard enough to find rentals as well nowadays. So yeah, look, there is no perfect way to do this, but if you do decide to buy first, you definitely should have your home ready to go, ready to sell, have your agent chosen, not have to then delay, be able to hit the ground running as soon as you have purchased and negotiate a long settlement. That's whether you buy or sell first, really. But in terms of bridging finance, let's start with what it actually is. Essentially, it's a short-term loan that covers the gap between buying your new home and selling your existing one. In simple terms, a lender lets you hold both properties at once. And what they do is they combine your existing mortgage and your new purchase into one, essentially a temporary loan. You're usually able to just pay interest on the existing debt, which obviously will be much higher than when you finally sell during what's called the bridging period. And then when your home sells, your sale proceeds will pay down the bridging loan and you're left with the standard mortgage on the new home. In terms of a timeline or how long is that bridge, Mike? Well, generally lenders will allow you up to 6 to 12 months, depending on their policy and your situation. In terms of when it's appropriate, you do have to have a lot of equity in your existing home. You've got to be realistic in terms of your sale timeline. You've got to have really strong borrowing capacity or serviceability because you do need to still be able to afford what's called the peak debt, which is that combined your existing loan plus fully financing that new purchase. So you do still need to meet a serviceability requirement with both loans running at once. Well, it's one loan, but in combination. So look, that is key considerations. Really, it's too risky when your suburb or price bracket as we've talked about, has slow turnover. That is pretty risky way or timeline to approach bridging finance. If you're already financially stretched, and that peak debt period would really hurt. That's obviously a key consideration. If you don't have that clear exit, if the property doesn't sell within the lender's bridging term, and you certainly want to be careful of being too optimistic. You really want to be conservative with what you might sell your property for. So, look, I mean, really, bridging finance should never be a way of avoiding making a decision. And yeah, but it certainly is. I would say it's much more common today than it was 10 or 20 years ago.
Dave, I've had a lot of buyers assume that they'll get bridging finance, and it's often a rude shock when their broker says, actually, no, you don't service the peak debt. Can you talk us through someone might not be eligible for bridging?
Well, look, I mean, there's no sort of black and white numbers. It does come down to your own situation. But ultimately, yeah, you do need to have really strong servicing, and you do need a big buffer of equity in your existing property. But there's no actual magic number. But you want to see clients who can comfortably hold both loans with that peak debt for at least 3 to 6 months without financial strain. On top of that, you want enough equity to cover the deposit and costs on the new purchase, plus a buffer. And that's often needs to be about 10 to 20% of your expected sale price to absorb. And that's to absorb if you end up getting a lower sale result. So, obviously being able to manage the cash flow is a big part of the picture. You need to be able to service both loans. And yeah, as you've said, Cate, people can make the assumption, I'll just get a bridging loan. And they don't really understand what's required and can be disappointed. So they should get their strategic mortgage broker to stress test a delayed sale. And look, we've actually got purpose-built software that does this for them and can actually factor in actual sales, different price points, what would an ideal purchase price be for them based on their personal cash flow savings and LVR. So we can do all this for our clients. But yeah, look, I think often people think it's simpler than what it actually is.
That's right. And it's not without cost as well. Even if you're looking at the cost of the interest repayments, it's not just that. There are administrative costs as well. For me as a buyer's agent, bridging finance is a last resort, and I absolutely make sure that I've seen it approved in writing or I've had a conversation with the strategic mortgage broker before I rely on it as a backup, because the absence of it might influence how quickly I will go shopping with that client and what sort of risk position I'll let them step into.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of management, isn't there? Anytime someone's upgrading and looking to buy and sell, whatever the order, and whether or not there's bridging finance, there's a lot of machinations to work through with your clients.
Yeah. I would say more than half of our upgrade and downsize purchases involve a sale and a purchase in tandem. More than half.
Yeah.
So it is
I'd
the
say
questions that you would be.
Yeah,
and it's a
maybe
very
higher.
intense process for people. It's very stressful. They assume the worst, which is that you'll get to settlement day and you haven't sold or settled, and there's an issue, and you might be forfeiting a deposit and facing legal action, and that's the worst case scenario. But we do navigate this all the time, and there's definitely an order to do it in, dependent on the scenario and the person, and as you've said, whether they've got bridging as an option. And even then, they've got to sometimes have an accommodation solution or a plan B, because if they sell first and they settle days or weeks or months later, where do they live? So those are all the things that we cover.
A lot of it's tied to your risk profile at the end of the day. What are you most comfortable with in terms of the order?
But no matter your risk profile, it sounds safest to never assume that you'll just get bridging finance. You actually need to make an inquiry and talk to someone like you, Dave, to just be sure that you are going to be eligible if you're thinking that's part of your strategy.
Exactly, Mike. Look, honestly, it's it's 5% who have access bridging finance,
Yeah,
give or
wow.
take.
Cate, when it comes to making an offer subject to sale, this is something that we sort of talk about being, almost an impossibility in a hot market. Like the more conditions you have, the less chance you've got of doing something. Things are
Yeah.
a little bit more balanced. It is more of a buyer's market, but all those things withstanding, should you make an offer subject to sale, or can it be always a bad idea?
Look, it's probably my least favourite condition, Mike. Not just because it highly disadvantages you. You've really got to have a firm idea of how quickly you're likely to sell and what price range you're likely to achieve. And if you don't, this one can be heartbreaking and a bit relationship damaging with the agent as well. And the reason I say that is I've seen it plenty of times before where I'm waiting for a property to fall over, so a purchase arrangement to fall over, so that I can pounce in for my client, because the agent might say, "Oh, we signed this up for 640 on a subject to sale, and they still haven't sold, and the vendor's getting edgy, and we've had another request for an extension." And I will say to the agent, "I'm here, I'm in the background, I'm ready to go. Next time they ask for an extension, please say no, because I'm ready to complete the contract." So that is one of the risks that you have. You've gone down this path, you think you've got the home of your dreams, you're quickly trying to sell yours. Well, imagine if you then did have a transaction on yours and it was still not unconditional. So you're subject to someone else's finance, or you're subject to even the cooling off period. And then the house that you've bought, they refuse to give you an extension. But you're really nervous, you're hamstrung. What do I do? Do I cancel this contract and then I'm bound to potentially sell mine? It's a really messy minefield. And that's one reason why I don't like it. And invariably, people always go for extensions because they haven't allowed themselves enough time to get an unconditional sale. And if you are considering this, it can work effectively. In fact, I have helped clients do it. I actually helped my parents do it during COVID. They were selling a coastal property on the Mornington Peninsula, and they were purchasing an apartment in the city. And it was the one time I thought to myself, apartments are so on the nose and they've lost so much ground value-wise, and everyone wants to go down to the Mornington Peninsula or the Surf Coast. My parents are actually in a pretty good position to make this one of their conditions, because their risk appetite was zero, and I had to manage that. And so they did get a sale. They actually got a really good price on their property. My dad did a FaceTime with the potential buyer, and it was just one of those really strange times during COVID where they sold to a buyer who was sight unseen, who paid a decent price, and they purchased a property in the city that they had seen months prior to lockdown, and they'd ruminated on it. Occasionally it comes together and it works really well, but you need to have conditions like I've just spoken about, where one is really favourable and the other one is the purchase that you're making. You're less likely to be facing competition. But yes, subject to sale, it is my least favourite. I prefer people also to know what they're working with. So if you're subject to your sale and you haven't done your sums on a really nasty conservative sale price, you might be facing a situation that you didn't anticipate, and one that's very stressful.
There's a funny parallel with some of the work that we do as quantity surveyors. Sometimes we will estimate a trade that's tendering for a job. It could be the painting trade or the carpentry trade. And we've done work for them, and these are significant reports. And we've had one particular person that came back and didn't pay their bill. And we sort of asked the question, like, when are you going to be doing that? Like, "Oh, we didn't win the job." And I was like, yeah, that's not how it works, because otherwise I'd be there in the room with you, like going like, "Let's talk about this. How are we going to pitch it?" Like I'm signing up to their ability to close a deal. Like it's such a weird thing, because like subject to sale, it's like, well, I don't know if their price expectations are reasonable. I have no idea about this property. I don't know if their selling
Yeah.
agent is any good. Like there's so many variables, right? So I'm guessing that it's probably way better than doing a subject to sale is trying to massage some of the terms, like a longer settlement period or rent backs, and then there's all sorts of
Totally.
things that you can do around early access. So that'll be a huge part of what you do as a BA, I guess. Like, what are your tips
It
and tricks
is.
around negotiating those sorts of things?
Yeah, look, I would much prefer that. And just to touch on subject to sale before we close that conversation off, if you are in a position where that is the only avenue that you're comfortable with, the best thing that you can do is give the agent on the property that you're trying to purchase a really good idea of how far down the track you are with selling your property. So if you were to say to an agent, look, I've already engaged, I've already signed an authority, my expectation for a sale price, is hopeful, but I'm willing to take something that's quite conservative to make this work. The appraised value that I was quoted was X to Y. I'm willing to, take something a little bit underneath that. And my first open is next week, or they're already talking to 3 different buyers. If you can give the agent, the selling agent for the property that you're trying to purchase, enough confidence to sell your story to their vendor, you stand a much better chance of getting that one across the line.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
Now,
look, I mean, I just quickly, I think it's really just about the last option you want to go with,
Yeah.
subject to sale. You put yourself, as Cate's touched on, and I just want to sort of reinforce this to our listeners. I mean, you put yourself at a lot of risk when it comes to actually successfully purchasing the property you want to buy. Now, it puts you out of being able to bid at auction, for example, because they're unconditional purchases. So there's a whole bunch of properties that you can't even buy unless you're not actually going to put that clause in there. So you are running the risk, but or you're just not able to negotiate and bid at auction. So, but you're quite likely to lose properties that you otherwise would have purchased. So, like, it is just about the most conservative option that you can, go with as a purchaser. So, I would encourage you to spend more time going through the different ways you can mitigate your risk by either buying first or selling first and getting comfortable with that, and spend more time in that space and getting to a point where you're comfortable one way or another, rather than going down this pathway. It's really very rare.
Yeah, agreed.
So when we are trying to massage the dates and the numbers and maybe offering rent backs, just to, we love this place. We want to get this deal
Yeah.
across the line, Cate. Like,
Yeah.
I suppose some of these terms, they're not all created equal, and it comes down to the skill of the negotiation. And of course, like how much demand there is for the property. Like, what sort of guidance have you got around this?
We have to understand the plight of the vendor. We need to know what's going on at the other end of the transaction, because if I had one recently where this vendor had agreed to a short settlement on their purchase, and so they were not prepared to offer us a long settlement, and they were in the same position where they needed to sell and settle on the same day as their purchase because they couldn't get bridging finance either. So when you've got a fixed date like that, it's then a real discovery about the goodwill of the vendor and what physical plans they have to enable exiting that property and moving into their next one, because it's highly unlikely that everyone sleeps the night at their house before settlement, and then on settlement day, they pack up their sleeping bag and they have all of the boxes ready to go into the truck, and then the other truck's waiting out the front. I mean, sometimes that happens, but usually when people have been inhabiting a property, they will clear themselves out a couple of days prior. They might have their things in storage and it goes straight onto a truck on settlement day, and they stay with grandma, or they might have a family holiday house. I mean, there are things that people can do to be portable before the big day comes. They might want to do a nice vacate clean and make sure the house is all ready for the new purchases. When that's the case, it really is about goodwill. What are your plans? Are you looking at moving into your brother-in-law's holiday home, for 3 weeks, and could we potentially have early access to your property? Where it gets a lot easier with buying a little bit of time and getting lease back arrangements and that kind of thing is if the property's already vacant. If it's been a rented property, the tenant's moved out, and you've got a settlement date, that vendor might be really happy to give you, 2 or 3 weeks prior. Or I've had situations where people have had a month or two prior, so they've been able to get the kids and all of their stuff out of their family home, stage it, have a really easy campaign where they're not having to run around cleaning the house every time there's an open, because they've already moved into the house that they're going to purchase and settle, and they're just paying market rent. So you've got to understand the plight of your vendor before you can entertain moving in early or leasing back. But my goodness, it works really well when you can organise early access. And I was very fortunate with my mum and dad's deal to be able to facilitate that, because their vendors had already vacated and moved into something else. So my parents were able to get in early on a license agreement, move all of their things. And this was during COVID. So, they were ferrying things from the Mornington Peninsula to the CBD. It was quite amazing. It doesn't always go like that. But where you've got a vacant property, or you can have that conversation where there might be a holiday house, or they're in a position where they have got bridging finance, then you can have the conversation. I do recall
some people are in a position they don't even need bridging finance as well.
Yeah.
So they actually can have bought and settled and give themselves a week or two and settle 1 or 2 weeks later. And so again, a good strategic mortgage broker will have figured this out with them. And so they understand they don't even need to sell, and they don't even need bridging finance. Obviously, you've got to be in a really strong financial position, but then you're in that circumstance, that ideal circumstance that Cate's talking about, where you can gradually move your stuff into the new house, unpack it over that week or two. You can finish tidying up the old house over a week or two. And look, that is the ideal world. That is really, you're not all the rush of the simultaneous settlement, which is most common, but you're also not needing any sort of bridging finance as well.
Yeah. I remember having this purchase scenario, gosh, it would have been about 4 years ago, and the property was vacant, but the vendor really wanted the sale proceeds. They probably really needed the sale proceeds. And so the agent said to me, we can consider any of your special conditions, but settlement has to be 30 days. I thought, oh dear, I've got these clients that want to sell their house, and I want someone to have 150 days when they're selling by auction. And the reason for that is, in that 150-day window, you'll probably spend the first 2 or 3 weeks cleaning up your garden and fixing a few things and interviewing agents. Then you'll select your agent, and then they will coordinate your campaign. You'll have a 4-week campaign. So that already swallows up potentially 2 months worth of your 150 days. And then when auction day comes, you're in a position to say yes to someone who wants a 90-day settlement. Now, if you only had a 120-day settlement, then the most that you can say yes to on auction day is 60 days, which is sort of the standard. That's the average. But it means that you can't say yes to someone who wants a long settlement, so you're already losing that buyer. And I meet people that say, oh, it's cool, I've got a 90-day settlement, I can sell my house. Well, by the time you get to auction day, you'll be lucky to be able to tolerate anyone with a 45, and it will probably be 30, which really backs you into a corner. So with this particular situation that I was dealing with, I said to the agent, well, we really want 150. I'd cop 120. And he said, no way, they won't come at it. They're paying X, Y, Z, or they're losing this much in interest, and they're looking at lost opportunity. So I said, okay, well, what about I go about this a different way? In the end, we agreed to a 60-day settlement with the option for me to purchase another 30 days for the cost of $10,000 or whatever it was. I think we worked it out, $8,000, whatever the holding cost was. So I said to my buyers, you'll know what your base price is, and for every 30 days that you want thereafter, it will cost you a bit more, and you're covering their holding costs while you're taking the time to get the right price tag for your home. It took a while to massage the condition and get it across the line, but it was agreed to. So there's all kinds of ways that we can be creative.
Yeah, you just need 2 people to agree, right? You can ask for anything, and they can agree to anything, within reason, right?
Yes.
I think what we're touching on here is one of the key areas that people often neglect, and that causes them stress, and it's the settlement period. And so people don't actually go into a purchase or a sale with the understanding of negotiating that and making sure it's lengthy whichever one they do first. And so this is the oversight that most people fall into the trap of. And there's so much that goes into planning an upgrade or a sale, working out the finances, working out where you're going to buy, who you're going to use to sell, what your LVR is going to be, what your repayments are going to be, all these types of things. And people often overlook this key component, the settlement period. And really, it can be the key element to have a relatively stress-free upgrading process. And that harks back even to that first example you said, Cate, where the vendors who you're buying from, they didn't plan a long settlement. So that's why there was all the stress and pressure. And so I really just want to, double click on this point for our listeners, because you'll be surprised with all the things that we're working through and working out, how often people neglect actually making sure whichever one they do first, they have a long settlement period. And as you just touched on, Cate, often they underestimate what a long settlement period actually should be to make it quite stress-free for them.
That's right. It's not the date that you sell your property. It's the date that you settle. You might have an amazing buyer who's willing to pay whatever, but they want a 150-day settlement. And you might find yourself in a position where you can't say yes to that.
Yeah.
The maximum stress situation can lead to a panic buy, a suboptimal purchase, and especially if it's owner-occ, you're stuck with it for at least a reasonable amount of time, or you're forced into a position where you're selling below really what should be the market value for it. So in terms of avoiding that situation, how does it work? Because we've talked about finance, we've talked about different options, rent back period, settlement periods, swapping cash for holding costs, but there's the conveyances, there's the pest and building. There's a million different things and considerations that need to happen, but it doesn't seem to me to be any particular professional's job. It's kind of a conversation between the broker, between the buyer's agent, and the purchaser sort of scheduling it themselves. So, what works and what doesn't when it comes to avoiding that maximum stress, poor outcome?
Well, understanding if your property is a little bit unique. That's a quick one to ask yourself, and pick an agent that's going to be brutally honest with you. Do not pick someone that will just tell you what you want to hear, because that will not get you where you need to be. Also, run the numbers on the worst case scenario and really be honest about a scenario that you really hate, but you're willing to accept if that's the way the cards fall. Because getting a low price is really disappointing, but losing your deposit and getting sued is way worse.
Dave, there's a lot of technology around moving now. Like you can use a third-party provider to connect your internet and your electricity, and it's a whole cottage industry that has made that part of things really, really seamless. And it makes me think about this term called loan porting. I mean, wouldn't that be wonderful if we just unplug the loan here and we plug it in over there? Is that what loan porting means? Like, talk us through it.
I mean, in the simplest terms, it means keeping your existing loan and basically swapping securities, moving out the home or property you've sold and bringing in the one you've purchased. That's it in a nutshell. And we have touched on some of this in episode 128 for our listeners, if you want to go back and have a listen. Why would you do it? It saves you on discharge fees and application fees. There is an admin fee to do this. It might mean you keep a really good rate that is no longer available to new customers, or you might have fixed and have break costs on a fixed rate or a great fixed rate in place. It can avoid having to do a serviceability assessment. So this is helpful in particular if you wouldn't service for the new loan to purchase the new property. You'd hope you can afford it though, even if a lender wouldn't provide you with the money. It obviously means a fair bit of less paperwork. We all know there's a lot of paperwork with setting up a new loan. It really comes down to timing and being able to just transfer in the new property to replace the old one as security.
Thank you, Dave. That is slightly more complicated than the moving electricity
Complicated.
providers, but
it's so good. When it can be ported, it's great.
yeah, especially if the serviceability is a little bit sketchy. It's like rather than having to go for the loan, it's like, no, just it's all fine. It's all security. We'll just slide
Yeah,
this one
nothing
in.
to see here.
I mean, that's a shocker, and that one leaving is an absolute beauty that you take to the bank any day. But yeah, obviously there's a little bit more to it than that. I'm interested, Cate. We talked a little bit about timing, right? So you talk about 150-day settlement. That's a big chunk of a year, and markets can move quite a lot, especially when you see things like government grants. There was lots of stories about below the caps, properties moving 50 to 100K in a month or two. There's obviously risks with that timing if the market's going up and down, but is there an inverse to that? Are there market risks when the transaction is fairly side by side?
Yeah, well, when it's side by side, like we've talked about, you've got to pull it off. You have to pull it off. So if you're prepared to take that risk and buy and sell at the same time, so start looking for property before you've got an unconditional contract on yours, or sell yours before you've found the ideal home. The risk of something going wrong is a real risk. And what is your plan B? You have to have a plan B if you take that risk. So in other words, if you're looking at buying in the same market and you can't be guaranteed that you will have sold and settled your current home before it's time to settle your next home, you have to have a plan B. And that might be that you've got bridging finance, or that, as Dave said, you can actually afford to hold both, even though it's very uncomfortable, or you've got family support financially. You have to have a plan B. And likewise, if you're looking at trying to do this in tandem and you find that you've got a great buyer and a great price for your current home, but it's a short settlement and you haven't settled your future home, where will you live? What can you do? And for a lot of people, they get really nervous about that. Oh, I'll try and get a 3-month, short-term rental. It will cost an absolute fortune to try and, Airbnb or short stay somewhere. And no one loves the idea of getting a removals truck and moving twice, but sometimes it could pay to just take out a 12-month lease in this climate and move in, and let's say it's 4, 5, 6 months that you're living there, and then you're vacating, you're giving notice, you're breaking your lease, and you're paying for the advertising, and someone else will move in and take on your lease. And that happens more readily than people can imagine. If you'd asked me about this 6, 7, 8 years ago, I would have said, well, weigh up the risks, because if you don't find a tenant at the price that you paid, you have to cover the differential for whatever the replacement tenant is then paying. And you might find that you're paying $800 a week and you could only get someone in there at $700 a week. So then you've got 9 or 8 months worth of the year to pay that differential. That's not a nice levy to have to pay. But in this climate, it's very rare that you couldn't get a replacement tenant, because our vacancy rates are so tight.
Yeah, they've just ticked up recently, but it's still nowhere near a balanced market. I'm very keen to hear some gold nuggets from you two, but before we do that, I'd love to hear from your experience, and you've both been in the game from sort of different angles in the property space for a long time. What have you seen that's worked really, really well, and what are some of the disaster cases that stick in your mind that maybe our listeners can stick in theirs so they can avoid that situation as well?
Look, I've seen disaster cases when I've been on the other side of it. When I'm representing a buyer and an agent is saying, just make me an offer. As long as you can settle by the 14th of September, we'll consider anything. Like, that is a very motivated vendor, and dare I say desperate. And I know when a vendor is desperate, when it gets to that desperation point, your pride goes out the window and you're telling the agent, I'm desperate. Find anyone that can make this settlement work. I will consider any price. I see that a lot. And if you get, I think the worst scenarios that I've seen is when a seller unfortunately gets caught in a really tough market. And I think to the most recent market shock that we've had, it was the budget announcement. Imagine being someone who's selling a property that had enormous investor appeal, and all of a sudden you've bought your property the week prior to budget night and you're trying to sell after budget night. That would be very, very stressful, and I know that it was.
Dave, any ones that stick out for you?
Oh, look, I think the worst scenarios is when people feel they've bought first and feel a real pressure to sell, and the market isn't as strong as they would have liked. They don't have as many buyers as they would expect. The property gets passed in at auction. They're under pressure to sell it to reach the settlement date of their purchase, and they have to take a haircut on the price. And that's the main stress. I mean, there is times where people purchased and then are struggling to sell, and they've got the bridging finance, but it's getting, they've overpitched the price. Their agent has overpitched it. The property's become stale. Initially, they're playing hard to get, but now it's been on the market for a long time and they're getting late in the bridging finance stage. And the whole journey of the sale has been stuffed up from the start, basically. And, so look, it's that type of situation. So it tends to err on the side of buying first and the sale journey not going anywhere like they had hoped or expected. And often that is because they were too unrealistic. I mean, sometimes they can be unlucky in a changing market, but often, they were too unrealistic about what, they weren't conservative enough about what might happen with the sale. And part of that is because that's what the agents had been telling them. But still, I think ultimately, you need to do your own due diligence, and generally when things go wrong is because people haven't taken the time in one or two particular areas when it comes to an upgrading process, buy and sell process.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Hopefully we've got enough ammunition there for the people listening as they can avoid these situations, because it does sound very, very stressful. And obviously we've got a great opportunity for people at the moment to upgrade. But of course, if you're trying to do the dance of selling and buying in one, there's a lot of things to think about, as you guys have elucidated exceptionally well today, as you always do. Let's go to our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
Okay, my gold nugget is all about the selling agent that you choose. You've purchased a property, or you're looking to purchase a property and you're selling in tandem. You need to pick a selling agent who will give it to you straight. They will tell you exactly what your worst case scenario looks like, and they will defend the reasons behind their appraised values of where they think your likely selling price sits, and they'll talk to you about the genuine threats, the type of buyer that you're looking for, and how quickly they think they could sell it. The worst thing you can do is go with the agent that tells you the biggest price or tells you all the things that you want to hear. Because right now, you need someone who is absolutely on your team and giving you the good, the bad, and the ugly, and preparing you for everything that you need to navigate this journey.
My gold nugget is getting the planning right up front. Take the time, sit down with your strategic mortgage broker. You need to get pre-approval in place. You need to run the numbers of what it could look like if you sell. Here's a good result. Here's a really conservative bad result. What is the range that my property that I buy might purchase for? You have to get pre-approved based on what the sale looks like. The bank will do that, and the purchase price. You need to have done your due diligence on what prices are selling for in the market. You need to get all your ducks in a row, because it's when you don't get your ducks in a row that stress occurs. And look at it, for me, it's pretty simple. Like, you've got to ask yourself, is there something I'm worried about? If there is, you need to sit down and work through that until you're comfortable. That's what a good advisor does. Okay, with people. What is there anything that's on your mind? Is there anything that's worrying you, stressing you? Then you talk about it, you explain what it is, and then your strategic mortgage broker, your buyer's agent, your real estate agent helps you work through to understand what the thing is that you're stressing about. So then you can understand, okay, well, I have choice A, I have choice B, I have choice C, where you ultimately feel comfortable. But what happens when people do feel stressed is they haven't taken the time to really understand every element and what are the elements that are stressing them, and take that off the table so you're comfortable and you understand. And that is my advice to anyone looking to go through this process.
It sounds a bit like defining sort of anxieties. My mother's a psychologist, so I'm maladjusted, as you would expect, but I learned a couple of things. And anxiety is kind of like, you know, you need to weigh up what is the risk of it happening, the likelihood, and how big is the damage. And I think if you run through all of the different things and go, how bad would it be if this happened? Like, it would be catastrophic, but it's very, very unlikely. Or how likely would this be happening? You know, very, very likely, but it's not a big deal. You go through the list, and I think that can take away some of the stress and help with the planning as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, look, you know, we control how we feel, okay, and that we've got resources to get the answers, you know. And if you find you're having a conversation with friends, family, or your spouse, oh, I'm just uncomfortable about this and that, but you've got an advisor or advisors who you work with, have the conversation with them, put it back onto them to make you feel comfortable. Rather, you know, that's their job. And the good ones will make you feel comfortable in that space. Talk it through with them. That's why they're paid whatever they get paid to provide the service to you. So, you know, put the responsibility back onto them to make and help you feel comfortable.
Great points. I picked up a lot from you guys. One particular one from you, Dave, is how relatively infrequent bridging finance is used. I don't think I've ever used it before. I've always massaged settlement dates. But Cate, you also said two things about agents. Is one, don't get one that's just going to tell you what you want to hear. And then sort of right next to that, you were talking about understand whether there's some uniqueness about your property. And I don't know why, but I've only ever bought and sold properties that were somewhat unique from an owner-op perspective.
You're a weird property kind of guy.
I'm a weird person. And when the agent comes in and says, like, we just really need someone to fall in love with this place, what they're saying is
I'm your man.
This doesn't apply to everybody. Yeah, I'm your man. That's been a great episode, and it's not insurmountable. It sounds a little bit scary, and there's all sorts of things that need to be considered. But as long as they're considered, they're planned for. You've got the advice. Knowledge is power in this one. So you've certainly given us lots of knowledge for this episode. So thanks very much, guys.
Pleasure.
Pleasure, Mike.